Black burial grounds under American cities that still exist. In May of 1991, a construction crew in Lower Manhattan dug down 25 feet and hit a coffin, then another, then 400 more. They had opened the African burial ground. 5 acres of graves, the city paved and built straight over. So here is the question for tonight. What is under your city? Ground-penetrating radar keeps finding them. Under the parking lot, under the freeway ramp, under the condo block that went up last year. Richmond, Charleston, Tampa, Sugarland, Clearwater. Your dead are not gone. They are underneath. Nobody carried them anywhere. When a city wanted that ground, the cheap way was never to relocate a cemetery. The cheap way was to grade over it and file fresh paper. The dead were never moved. They were only covered. Ground-penetrating radar is not a theory. It is a cart a technician pushes slowly across a parking lot, sending a pulse into the dirt and reading what bounces back. Undisturbed clay answers one way. A grave shaft, a rectangle of earth somebody once dug open and filled back in. Answers a different way, and it keeps answering that way for 300 years. The machine does not read the deed. It sees the whole. Since roughly 2018, teams pushing those carts across ordinary American ground have come back with the same result again and again. Black Christian, listening tonight. This is not a rumor from a family reunion. This is a filed survey with a date on it. Go back to that Manhattan morning with me. The site was 290 Broadway, a federal construction site where the General Services Administration was raising an office tower, roughly 24 feet down. Under a thick layer of 19th century fill, the crew found intact wooden coffins sitting in rows, not scattered bone, rows. By the time the digging was stopped, over 400 graves had been lifted out of that ground. 419 human beings to be exact. Men, women, a number of children that still stops me cold. They had lain there since the 16 and 1700s, a short walk from where the stock exchange opens each morning. I have sat with that number a long time, and here is where I land. 419 was not the cemetery. It was one corner of the cemetery that happened to fall inside one building footprint. The full ground is estimated at 5 to 6 acres, and many researchers believe it holds 10 to 15,000 burials. The rest are still there tonight, under offices and sidewalks in a street grid laid straight across the top. So tonight, we walk this city by city, survey by survey. Manhattan first, then Richmond, then Charleston, then Tampa, then Clearwater, then a school construction site outside Houston. And then we open the Bible, because scripture reached this subject long before the radar did. To understand how a city loses 400 graves, you have to go back further than the bulldozer. You have to go back to a room where men wrote a rule. In 1697, the New York Common Council took up the question of who could be buried in the Trinity Churchyard, the main burial ground of the colonial town. The record that survives points to a restriction on the burial of Africans there. That is the decision. Not a mood, not a general prejudice floating in the air. A council, a year, a written policy. I want to be precise about that, because precision is the whole point of this channel. Once that rule existed, the burials had to go somewhere. So they went north, outside the wooden palisade that marked the edge of the town, into a low ravine of unimproved land beside a tannery district. On the old Marshak plan of the city, drawn in the 1750s, you can find a space marked as a burial ground for Africans. 5 to 6 acres of it. That is not a legend. That is a map a colonial surveyor drew and signed, sitting today in an archive, showing exactly where the dead of a whole community were placed, by order of a governing body. And here is what many of us miss when we read that story quickly. The burial ground sat outside the palisade by design, not by accident. It was placed beyond the wall because a council put it beyond the wall. Later, when New York needed room, that same location, outside the old boundary, low ground, no perpetual endowment, no standing congregation to defend it, is precisely what made it easy to bury a second time under fill and pavement. The first decision set up the second decision. I have come to believe you cannot understand the 1991 shovel without the 1697 vote. Now follow that ground across the next 150 years. New York grew north, the way a fire grows. The ravines got filled in. Tanneries, potteries, and pottery kilns worked the area. Then the whole district was leveled and raised so the street grid could run across it. Historians estimate that 19th century fill raised the grade there by 16 to 25 feet. Think about what that means physically. A person standing on Broadway today is standing 2 stories above the surface where those funerals actually happened. Here is the strange mercy in that. The fill is exactly why the graves survived intact. If the burials had sat 2 feet under the sidewalk, 3 centuries of water mains, gas lines, subway tunnels, and basement excavations would have destroyed them entirely. Instead, the fill dropped a protective ceiling over the whole cemetery, and the coffins beneath it sat undisturbed, while a city built and rebuilt itself overhead. I have sat with that for a long while. The same dirt that hid them is the dirt that kept them. Because notice what nobody did. Nobody exhumed anybody. There is no record of a mass relocation, no receiving cemetery upstate, no ledger of transfers. The city grid was simply laid across the top, and the buildings went up. The word people reach for is erasure, but the honest word is layering. The graves were not removed from the earth. They were removed from the paperwork and from the public memory. And those are 2 very different operations from actually moving a body. Which brings us back to May of 1991. The General Services Administration, the federal agency that builds and manages government property, was preparing to put up the Ted Weiss Federal Building at 290 Broadway in Lower Manhattan. This was not a small private job. This was a federal construction site with a full environmental and archaeological review already on file. And here is the detail I want you to sit with. That review had already flagged the historical burial ground. The documentation acknowledged what might be down there before the first shovel went in. The prediction in the paperwork was that the 19th century construction had probably destroyed whatever was left. That prediction was wrong. The crews began finding intact human remains in wooden coffins, and the excavation kept going. Archaeologists worked the site while the schedule pressed forward, and remains were being removed at a pace that alarmed everyone watching. That is when Black New York moved. Church groups, community organizations, elected officials, and descendants pressed the federal government publicly and loudly to stop. They did not ask nicely, and they did not ask once. Mayor David Dinkins and Congressman Gus Savage of Illinois both pushed hard, and in 1992 congressional action shut the excavation down. Let me be plain about the sequence, because it repeats in every city we visit tonight. The agency had the report. The report was set aside. The community forced the halt. Not a lawsuit first, not a scholar first. Ordinary Black people who refused to let the digging continue quietly. What came out of that ground went to Howard University. 419 individuals were removed and studied there under Dr. Michael Blakey, who led the research team. And the work was structured with community oversight built into it from the start. That last part matters more than most people realize. The descendant community had a seat at the table, deciding what questions the research would ask. The skeletal analysis, the burial practices, the artifacts, all of it was studied as the record of a people, not as specimens pulled from a hole in the ground. Then came the honors, and the dates are worth memorizing. In 1993, the site was designated a National Historic Landmark. In 2003, the remains were carried back to Manhattan in hand-carved coffins from Ghana, in a ceremony called the Rites of Ancestral Return, and reinterred at the site with tens of thousands of people lining the route. In 2006, the ground became a national monument, from a rule in a council chamber in 1697 to a national monument in 2006. That is, 309 years. I want to hold there for one moment before we move on. Every honor on that list came after 1991, not before. The landmark, the reburial, the monument, the visitor center. None of it existed while the ground sat quiet under pavement. It took a bucket hitting a coffin lid and the community refusing to look away.
This is not a comfortable lesson, and I have gone back and forth on how to say it. But if you are waiting for an institution to bring you or your ancestor, the records of that last 30 years did not support that hope. Something has to surface first.
Now, between you and me, here is the thing that changed how I read all of this. Manhattan is not a freak story. Manhattan is a template. Once I laid the case files side by side, New York, Richmond, Charleston, Tampa, Clearwater, Sugar Land. The same 3 steps showed up in every single one, in the same order, decade after decade, in cities that had nothing else in common. That repetition is what turns a sad local story into something you can actually study. So let me walk you through the 3 steps, because once you know them, you can run this on your own county without needing anybody's permission. This is the starting condition everywhere. A town writes down where black residents may and may not be buried, and the answer is always the marginal ground, the low lot, the edge of town, the parcel nobody wanted for farming or building. Not consecrated ground inside the fence, outside it. And notice the mechanism because it matters. The community did not choose that ground out of preference. A rule assigned it. Every one of these cemeteries begins as an address handed down by a governing body. A wealthy churchyard sets up an endowment, and the interest pays a groundskeeper forever. A cemetery serving people who were barely permitted to own property had nothing like that. So the fence sagged. The grass came up. The founding generation died. The congregation moved as the neighborhood changed, and within 40 years, there was nobody left in the neighborhood who could point to the corner where their grandmother was laid. Neglect is not a moral failing of the families here. It is arithmetic. The arithmetic of who was allowed to accumulate money. That is the whole trick, and it happens on paper in an afternoon. A county board, a housing authority, a private buyer. Somebody files to have the parcel reclassified, and the cemetery legally ceases to be a cemetery. Roads get drawn. Lots get sold. And I want to be careful and exact here, because this is the accusation, and it deserves precision. What I am naming is a paperwork sequence carried out by identifiable boards and identifiable buyers, with dates attached. Not an accident, not a mystery, a filing. Which brings us to the single most important word in this entire subject: abandoned. When a record says a cemetery was abandoned, most people picture an empty field with nothing left in it. That is not what the word means. Abandoned is a legal category. It describes the absence of an active caretaking party. No trustees filing, no association paying, nobody appearing at the hearing. It says exactly nothing about whether human remains are still in the soil. I sat with that distinction for a long time before it fully landed on me. The bodies were never part of the finding. And here is what survives that filing. The county clerk's records still carry the original cemetery plat. Land records in this country are cumulative. They do not delete, they layer. So the 1901 survey that laid out the burial sections with numbered rows is still in the book. And the 1954 survey that laid out apartment buildings is also in the book. And anybody can pull both and set one on top of the other. When they line up, you are looking at a map of what is underneath a modern parking lot. That is how the Tampa case broke open. Somebody read the old plat. You can pull those documents yourself. A county recorder's office, a state archive, a university special collections library. Sunborn fire insurance maps, drawn block by block for insurance companies, often mark cemeteries plainly. Church minute books list burials. Funeral home ledgers list who paid, when, and where the body went. Many of us assume this kind of research requires credentials and a grant. It does not. It requires a name, a neighborhood, and an afternoon. I have come to believe that is the most underused inheritance black families in this country are sitting on.
Now, the question I get asked most, and the one I got wrong myself for years, if the grave are still there, where did the headstone go? For a long time I assumed a missing headstone meant a moved body.
That assumption is exactly backwards, and the reason is brutally simple. Removing stones costs a day. Removing burials costs years. A crew with a flatbed truck can clear a cemetery of markers before dinner, and the site then looks, to any passing eye, like an empty lot. Then consider what was actually marking those graves in the first place. Many were never stone at all. They were wooden markers, painted boards, iron crosses, a planted shrub, a conch shell laid on the mound. Wood rots inside a generation in wet ground. Iron rusts to nothing. And the stones that did exist were frequently sold for fill, used as construction rubble, or simply dumped. In several documented cases, granite markers turned up years later serving as the foundation stones of other structures. The surface memory went. The people did not. Because here is what the earth does not forget. When someone digs a grave shaft and fills it back in, the soil in that rectangle is permanently different from the soil around it. It is looser. It is mixed. The layers that took 10,000 years to form are scrambled. Undisturbed clay reads as clean horizontal bands. A disturbed shaft reads as a sharp-walled rectangle cutting straight down through those bands. That signature does not fade in a century. It does not fade in 3. Pave over it, and you have simply put a lid on a diagram of every grave that was ever dug there, which is precisely what ground-penetrating radar is built to see. The cart sends a radio pulse into the ground, and different densities of soil bounce that pulse back at different speeds. The technician watches a screen where a disturbed shaft appears as a distinctive curved reflection, called a hyperbola, at a consistent depth, in a consistent orientation, at consistent spacing. And that last part is what makes it evidence rather than guesswork. One anomaly is a tree root. 40 anomalies at the same depth, aligned east to west, spaced 6 feet apart in tidy rows, is a cemetery. Radar is rarely used alone. The standard method now pairs it with historically trained cadaver dogs, with small diameter soil cores that let a geologist read the disturbed layers directly. And with the archival work we just talked through, 4 independent methods converging on the same coordinates is a hard thing to argue with. And notice this, the surveys are non-invasive. Nobody has to be dug up. Nobody's rest is disturbed to prove they are there. That is exactly why the receipts keep multiplying since 2018. The technology got cheap, the method got standardized, and the answer keeps coming back yes. So let me take you to Tampa, Florida, because Tampa is where this stopped being a New York story and became an American one. Zion Cemetery was established in 1901 on Florida Avenue, one of the first cemeteries in Hillsborough County, set aside for black burials. And it was a real, working, dignified place. Families bought plots there. Funeral processions walked there. The Tampa Bay Times later traced the paper trail and found the deeds, the plats, the notices in the black press. Then, sometime in the 1920s and 30s, the cemetery simply stopped appearing in the record. No relocation notice, no receiving cemetery named. The land changed hands, and it stopped being described as a cemetery in the documents. And within 1 generation, the city of Tampa functionally did not know it had ever existed. What went up on top of it is the park that stays with me. Robles Park Village, a public housing complex built in the 1950s, sat directly over a portion of that ground. Families lived there for 60-some years. Children were raised there. Nobody who signed a lease was told what was underneath the slab. Another portion of the ground ended up under a commercial tow lot and warehouse space, which means, for decades, cars were being parked and towed above the graves of the people who built that part of the city.
I have read a lot of these files now, and that detail it's the one I keep coming back to, not malice. At that point, just a complete institution of forgetting, sitting on top of real people.
Then, in 2019, a survey team took ground-penetrating radar across the site. And the answer came back fast. Roughly 300 grave shafts, still in place, in rows, at consistent depth. Not scattered, organized, laid-out cemetery rows. And this time the response was different from 1991, and I want to give credit where the record supports it. The Tampa Housing Authority moved to relocate the residents. The buildings above the graves came down, and the agency committed the ground to a memorial rather than to redevelopment. Descendants and community researchers led that process from the front. It took 118 years for Zion Cemetery to get its name back on a map. But it got it back. Now drive 30 minutes west into Pinellas County, and it happens again in the same calendar year. Clearwater, Florida. The St. Matthew's Missionary Baptist Church Cemetery had served the black community there beginning in the early 1900s. By the 1950s, it had left the public record the same quiet way Zion did. The parcel was sold, developed, and eventually covered by the parking lot and offices of a private company on Holt Avenue, along with adjacent city-owned land. If you had stood in that lot in 2018 and told the people parking there what was 6 feet beneath their tires, they would not have believed you. There was nothing to see. That is the entire point. The radar survey in 2019 located roughly 300 graves under that parking lot and the ground around it. 300. And the company that owned the property, Frank Crum, did not fight the finding. They cooperated with the investigation and worked with the descendant community on how to mark and protect it. Then, before the year was out, a second survey a few miles away found more graves on Pinellas County School District property, tied to another lost black cemetery. 2 separate burial grounds. 1 county, 1 year, both found because somebody finally went looking with the right equipment. Sit with that arithmetic for 1 second, because it is the reason I made this video. 2 in 1 county, in 1 year, not 2 in the whole country. 2 in 1 county. There are more than 3,000 counties in the United States, and the overwhelming majority of them have never had a single systematic survey of their historically black burial grounds. I do not know what that number would come to if the work were finished, and I am not going to guess at a figure I cannot support. What I will say is that the ones we have found are not the exception. They are the sample. And the next one is a school. Sugar Land, Texas, sits southwest of Houston. And in 2018, the Fort Bend Independent School District was building the James Reese Career and Technical Center, a brand new campus meant to train the next generation of that community's children. An archaeologist monitoring the excavation, Rain Clark, spotted grave shafts in the cut. Work stopped. And what came out of that ground over the following months was 95 people, 95 sets of human remains, buried in simple wooden coffins in rows, on land nobody had listed as a cemetery. They are known now as the Sugar Land 95. Think about the setting for a moment. A school. Children were going to walk to class over them. The bones told the investigators who these people were before any document did. Almost all of them were men. Most died between the ages of 14 and 70, and a striking number were in their teens and 20s. Their skeletons carried the marks of extraordinary physical labor, enlarged muscle attachment sites, spinal compression, healed fractures, and a pattern of stress lesions on the bone consistent with malnutrition, combined with relentless work. One of the individuals was buried still wearing an iron shackle. That is not an interpretation. That is an object recovered in place, in a grave, in Fort Bend County, Texas. The system that put them there has a name, and I want to name it precisely rather than gesture at it. Convict leasing was a legal arrangement under which the state of Texas leased prisoners to private companies, sugar plantations, railroads, mines, who paid the state for their labor and were responsible for housing and feeding them. Black men were arrested and convicted at rates the system depended on, and the death rate on leased labor camps was catastrophic. Texas abolished the practice in 1912. The remains at Sugar Land date to roughly that era, the 1870s through the early 1900s. That land had been the Imperial State Prison Farm. The cemetery was simply never carried forward onto later maps. Now come back east to Virginia. Shockoe Bottom, in Richmond, held one of the largest markets for the sale of enslaved people in the United States, and just up the slope from it lay a burial ground for free and enslaved black Richmonders, in use from around 1750 into the 1800s. Over the following century, that ground was covered by a rail line, then a gas station, then Interstate 95, and then, for years, it served as a paid parking lot for Virginia Commonwealth University. People fed a meter and left their cars there every weekday morning. It took sustained pressure from Richmond activists and descendants, years of it, before the parking lot was finally closed and the ground reclaimed in 2011. And then Charleston, South Carolina, where the story turns in a way I did not expect the first time I read it. In 2013, during construction on Anson Street downtown, crews uncovered 36 sets of human remains from the 1700s. The city could have processed them as an archaeological inventory and moved on. Instead, a descendant-led project took charge of what happened next. Researchers studied them with genetic and isotopic analysis, and a community process gave each of the 36 an African name chosen through prayer and deliberation. In 2019, they were reburied in a public ceremony, called by name, one at a time, with thousands of people present. I want to be precise about what all of this is, because precision is the only thing that makes it useful to you. These are not rumors. Every case I have named tonight has a date, a location, a responsible agency or property owner, and a filed report you can request. Manhattan, 1991, the General Services Administration. Tampa, 2019, the Tampa Housing Authority. Clearwater, 2019, a private company on Holt Avenue. Sugarland, 2018, the Fort Bend Independent School District. Richmond, reclaimed in 2011. Charleston, uncovered in 2013. Reburied in 2019. 6 receipts, and every one of them was found because somebody decided to look. Now let me show you what the bodies themselves were saying the whole time. Here is where this stops being a story about paperwork and becomes a story about faith. And I have been sitting with this part for a long time. When the researchers at Howard University laid out the burial data from 290 Broadway, one pattern came up over and over with a consistency that is hard to overstate. The overwhelming majority of those 419 people were laid in the ground the same way. Head to the west, feet to the east. Not randomly placed, not oriented to the property line or the slope of the ravine. West to east, grave after grave after grave across generations of burials, stacked in that ground. Now understand what that orientation means, because it is not decoration, and it is not coincidence. It is a Christian burial rite with centuries of history behind it. You lay the body with the feet toward the east, so that on the day of resurrection, when the dead are raised, the person sits up already facing the sunrise, facing the direction from which the returning Lord is expected. Matthew 24, verse 27 puts it plainly. As the lightning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. That is the whole theology of that grave shaft. Get up facing the dawn. And this is exactly why archaeologists treat orientation as evidence rather than as a guess. One body facing east could be an accident of terrain. 400 bodies facing east, dug by different hands across a century, is a repeated, deliberate act. It is a community doing the same careful thing every time it buried someone, under conditions that gave them almost nothing else. I want you to hear what that means. The people in that ground were not buried as property. They were buried as believers, by believers, with a specific expectation about what God was going to do at the end of it. Somebody said words over each of those graves. Then there is the other half of the evidence, and it is the half that shows two things being true at once. Among the individuals recovered at the African burial ground, researchers documented dental modification, teeth deliberately filed or shaped in patterns consistent with practices from West and Central African societies. That is not a subtle marker. Filed teeth are done in life, in adolescence, usually as part of a rite of belonging in a specific community. When you find them in a Manhattan grave, you are looking at a person who was born on the other side of the ocean and carried a homeland's mark in their mouth to the day they died. The burials also held objects. Glass beads and cowrie shells were recovered with several individuals. One woman was found wearing a strand of beads and shells at the waist, a placement documented in West African contexts. There were coins, shells laid on coffins, and in one case, a coffin lid with a pattern of iron tacks that some researchers have read as an Akan symbol. Though I will tell you honestly that reading is debated, and I hold it loosely. What is not debated is the presence of the goods themselves. People were sending their dead into the ground with something in their hands. So hold both facts together, because most people force a choice between them, and I think that is the mistake. Head to the west, feet to the east. A Christian resurrection posture, filed teeth, cowrie shell, waist beads, an African life, remembered in the burial. That is not a contradiction, and it never was. That is a people who received the gospel and did not throw away their name to hold it. If you grew up in the black church, you already know that instinct in your bones, because you have watched your own family do it your whole life. And there is more in that soil still. Look at what they were buried in. The coffins recovered at 290 Broadway were not crates, and they were not sacks. They were hexagonal wooden coffins, the tapered shape you still see at a funeral home today, wide at the shoulders, narrowing to the feet, assembled with hand-forged iron nails. Many bodies have been wrapped in shrouds first, and archaeologists recovered the straight pins that held that cloth closed, still lying in position where they fell. Somebody sewed that shroud. Somebody hired a carpenter, or was the carpenter, working wood by hand after a full day of labor for another man. Every one of those steps cost money and hours, and these families had very little of either. Now set that against the law those funerals were held under. The New York Common Council passed ordinances in 1722, and again in 1731, restricting the burial of Africans in the city. The rules limited funerals to daylight hours, and capped the number of mourners permitted at the graveside, with 12 named in the later ordinance. Notice what was actually being regulated. Not the burial, the assembly. A governing body looked at black New Yorkers standing together at a graveside after dark and decided the gathering itself needed a law written against it. They understood what a funeral is. A funeral is where a community counts itself and hears its own voice. So the counting is what got legislated, and they buried their dead properly anyway. That is the sentence I want sitting in the middle of this segment, under a restriction on the hour, under a cap on the crowd. On ground a council assigned them past the wall, next to the tanneries, with no money, no standing in court, and no expectation that anyone would ever look for the place again. Those families still bought the wood, still pinned the shroud, still turned the body so the feet pointed east, toward the sunrise.
I have read that evidence many times, and it does not read to me as a defeated people. It reads as a congregation doing church at a graveside. Then there is the arithmetic of that ground, and honestly, this is the part that took me the longest to say out loud steadily.
Roughly 40% of the individuals recovered from the African burial ground were children. Some were infants. Several were newborns buried together with a woman, which tells you exactly what happened in that room on that night. In any burial population, a child ratio at that level is not a normal mortality curve for the era. It is a measurement of the conditions those families were held in. And remember where we are standing when we read it. This is not a rice plantation in the Carolinas. This is the wealthiest port town in the northern colonies. The adult remains carry the same testimony in another language, written into the bone itself. The analysis at Howard University documented enlarged muscle attachment sites, where tendons had been pulled at, over and over, past what a body is built for. Compression damage along the spine from carrying loads, fractures at the base of the skull, enamel defects of the kind that form when a growing child goes hungry for long stretches. Now I was taught a particular picture of northern slavery growing up. House servants, mild arrangements, nothing like the South. I believed that picture for years, and I want to say plainly that I was wrong. The bodies at 290 Broadway do not support it, and remember the scale of what was actually examined. Only one building footprint was ever excavated. 1. The burial ground itself is estimated at 5 to 6 acres, and many researchers place the total interred across it between 10 and 15,000 souls. 419 came up into the light, got studied, got honored, got carried home in hand-carved coffins from Ghana. The rest are lying under Lower Manhattan tonight, while you listen to this, in rows, head to the west, feet to the east, which is where Scripture picks this subject up, because the Bible has a great deal to say about bones nobody came back for. Open to Genesis 50, the last chapter of the first book in the Bible. Joseph is dying in Egypt. He has been prime minister of the most powerful nation on earth. He saved that nation from a 7-year famine, and if he asked to be buried in a pyramid, nobody in Egypt would tell him no. Instead, verse 25, "And Joseph took an oath of the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and ye shall carry up my bones from hence." Read that again slowly. The last recorded act of Joseph's life is not a blessing, and not a prophecy. It is a burial instruction, sworn under oath, about the location of his own remains. And that is not the only funeral in the chapter. The first half of Genesis 50 is Jacob's burial, and it is enormous, a procession leaving Egypt with chariots and horsemen, a 7-day mourning at the threshing floor of Atad, so large the Canaanites watching it named the place after the grieving they saw. The body is carried the whole distance to the cave of Machpelah, because Jacob made his son swear he would not be left in Egyptian ground. Consider what God chose to spend a chapter of Genesis on. Not a battle, not a law. Who carries the body? How far? To which field? Notice what that says about the mind of God on this subject. In Scripture, where a body is laid is never a sentimental detail. It is a covenant question. Every time. Look at Abraham. His first legal purchase in the Promised Land was not a house or a well. It was a grave, the cave at Machpelah, bought for 400 shekels of silver weighed out before witnesses at the city gate in Genesis 23, structured so the sale could never be disputed. Burial ground is the first property God's people own outright. Many of us grew up hearing those chapters treated as genealogy filler. I do not read them that way anymore. That chapter is a deed. Then watch the promise get kept, 4 centuries later. Exodus 13 verse 19. "And Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for he had straitly sworn the children of Israel." Set that scene properly before you move past it. This is the night of the Exodus. 2 million people are moving. Egypt is in chaos behind them, and the whole nation is running on a timetable God himself set. And in the middle of that, Moses stops to collect a coffin. He goes and gets Joseph. Whatever else got left behind in the panic of that night, those particular bones did not. Now count the years between those 2 verses. Roughly 400. 4 centuries of slavery, of forced labor, of generations born and buried, who never saw Canaan and had no reason left to believe anybody ever would. And across all of it, the location of one coffin was never lost. Somebody told somebody. A father told a daughter, over and over, for 400 years, this is where he is, and we are taking him with us when God comes for us. That is a diaspora that never lost the address of its dead. Sit with that contrast a moment. The thread finally closes in Joshua 24 verse 32. "And the bones of Joseph, which the children of Israel brought up out of Egypt, buried they in Shechem." Understand what that verse is doing. The final line of Joseph's story is written more than 400 years after the man died, in a different book, under a different leader, after a war, and it is a burial notice. Scripture will not let the thread drop. The narrative has moved onto armies and territory, and the writer still stops to tell you the body reached the right field, and Scripture goes further than caring. 2 Kings 13 verse 21 is one of the strangest verses in the Old Testament, and almost nobody preaches it. A burial party is out with a body when raiders appear, and in their panic, they hastily throw the dead man into the sepulchre of Elisha. And when the man was let down and touched the bones of Elisha, he revived and stood up on his feet. The prophet had been dead a long time. His bones were still carrying something. The Greek Septuagint preserves the same account in the books it calls the Third and Fourth Kingdoms. The writer of Sirach returns to the same theme in chapter 49, verse 10, saying of the 12 prophets that their bones flourish again out of their place. I have come to believe that is one of the quietly radical ideas running through all of Scripture. In the Bible, a grave is not a full stop. It is a comma. The remains of the faithful are consistently treated as still connected to the covenant, still waiting on something, still addressed by God directly. That is an entirely different category of thing than what governs a county zoning meeting, where a burial ground is an obstacle on a development timeline. Then Hebrews 11 sets the final piece in place. And this is the passage I want you to carry out of this segment. The chapter runs through the heroes of faith by name: Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Sarah, Moses, Rahab. Then the writer says time would fail him to tell the rest, and turns to the ones history never recorded. Verse 38. Of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts, and in mountains, and in dens and caves of the earth. Read the order of that sentence carefully, because the order matters. The world was not worthy of them, and then the world lost them. Look closely at what the chapter does with those unnamed people. It does not rank them below the famous ones. It does not treat an unmarked grave as evidence of a smaller life or a lesser faith. The text says the world failed to deserve them. The missing marker is an indictment of the world, never a verdict on the person in the dirt. There are 2 registers being kept over this ground, and they have never matched. There is the county register, which can lose an entire cemetery in an afternoon with 1 filing. And there is the register heaven keeps, which Hebrews insists has not misplaced a single name. So here is where I land after walking all of this. An unmarked grave is not an unrecorded life. Those 2 ideas got collapsed into each other in this country, and the collapsing was convenient for a great many people holding a great deal of property. The paperwork went missing. The bodies did not. And if God spends a chapter of Genesis on the movement of a coffin and stops an Exodus mid-flight to load one onto a cart, and closes Joseph's story 4 centuries later with a burial notice, then I do not believe he has been indifferent to 5 acres under Lower Manhattan. Which brings us to Ezekiel. There is one more field in Scripture we have to walk, and it is not a tomb, not a cave, and not a purchased parcel with a deed attached. It is an open valley, full of bones nobody buried, that God carried a prophet out to see with his own eyes. Every case file we open tonight, Manhattan, Tampa, Clearwater, Sugar Land, Richmond, Charleston, has been walking toward this chapter. Ezekiel 37 is not a poem about national morale. It is where God stands, a man in the middle of a field of forgotten dead, and asks him a question. Ezekiel 37, verse 1. The hand of the Lord was upon me, and carried me out in the spirit of the Lord, and set me down in the midst of the valley which was full of bones. Stop on the verb. Set me down. Ezekiel does not walk to this place, does not choose it, and is not shown it from a safe hillside. He is picked up and put down in the middle of it, with no exit, and nothing to look at but what lies around his feet. God could have described this field in a sentence. Instead, God physically stands the man inside it. Verse 2. And caused me to pass by them round about, and behold, they were very many in the open valley. And lo, they were very dry. He has walked through it. Round about, a circuit, a survey. Back and forth until the scale registers in his body, and not just his eyes. Very many, and very dry. Dry is the word carrying the time in it. Dry means these bones have lain exposed to sun and wind for years, uncovered, unburied, out where anybody passing could see them. Somebody did see them. Nobody stopped. Understand what an open valley of unburied bones meant to a Hebrew prophet, because a modern reader can miss the horror entirely. In that world, leaving a body unburied was among the most severe things that could happen to a person. It is the language of judgment all through the prophets. Bodies left upon the face of the field, none to bury them, none to mourn. Burial was the last duty the living owed the dead, and its absence meant the community that should have performed it was gone, scattered, or would not come. These are people nobody came back for. Now hold that image against the ground we have been walking all night. A place full of the dead, covered by nothing but time and neglect. Very many, and nobody counting. A lot in Tampa with 300 grave shafts under a housing block for 60 years. A parking lot in Richmond where people fed a meter every morning above black Richmonders, sold in the market at the bottom of that same hill. A school campus outside Houston with 95 men in the dirt. I do not read Ezekiel 37 as a metaphor from far away anymore. I read it standing on asphalt. Verse 3, and he said unto me, Son of man, can these bones live? Now catch who is being asked, because this is the hinge of the chapter, and it gets read past constantly. God does not announce what he is about to do. God does not say, Behold, I will raise them. God turns to the one man standing in that field and puts the question to him. Of every being present in that valley, the Spirit of God, the prophet, and several thousand sets of dry bone. The one interrogated is the human being with a working pulse. And Ezekiel's answer is one of the most honest lines in all of Scripture. And I answered, O Lord God, thou knowest. He does not say, Yes, Lord, of course, you can do anything. He does not say no. He says, You know, and I do not. Standing in a field of dry bones, the theologically correct answer and the emotionally honest answer were not the same answer that day, and the prophet gave the honest one.
I love that he did not perform a certainty he did not have. I have sat in that same gap myself, so why does God ask first? Because in the very next verse, the prophet get handed an assignment, and God does not hand that assignment to a man who has not yet looked at the field.
The question forces Ezekiel to take the measure of what is in front of him, to count it, to feel how dry it is, to admit out loud that he cannot fix one single bone of it. Only then does the command come. I believe God wanted the prophet to want it before God moved. So let me put that question in the room where it actually lives tonight. Somebody is standing over Zion Cemetery in Tampa. Somebody is standing over Shockoe Bottom in Richmond, over a school campus in Fort Bend County, over 5 acres in Lower Manhattan, with a street grid across the top. And the question being put to that person is not, can God do this? That was never in doubt, and it is not what God asked. The question is the one Ezekiel got. Son of man, you, the one with the pulse, standing in the field, holding the survey. Can these bones live? Verse 4. Again he said unto me, Prophesy upon these bones, and say unto them, O ye dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. There it is. The command does not go to the bones. The command goes to the man. God does not speak directly to that field. God tells a living human being to open his mouth and speak to it. And I want you to feel how absurd that assignment is. Ezekiel is being told to preach a sermon to a congregation with no ears, no lungs, and no pulse. Any reasonable person standing there would have asked what possible good talking could do. He does it anyway. Verse 7. So I prophesied as I was commanded, and as I prophesied, there was a noise, and behold, a shaking, and the bones came together, bone to his bone, a noise, then a shaking, then movement across the whole valley at once. Notice that nothing happened until he spoke, and everything happened the moment he did. The power was never in Ezekiel. He could not raise a finger bone on his best day. But the sequence God chose required a man to speak first. And verse 8 tells you what that assembly actually produced. And when I beheld, lo, the sinews and the flesh came up upon them, and the skin covered them above. But there was no breath in them. Read that carefully, because most people rush past it to get to the happy ending. Full bodies, complete, sinew, muscle, skin, every part restored and lying in order across that valley, and not one of them alive. The shaking stage is real, and it is necessary, and it is not the same thing as breath. I think that is exactly where this work sits right now, and it is why I do not oversell it. The survey is the shaking. The marker is the shaking. The ceremony, the memorial, the county resolution, the plaque with the names on it. All of that is bone coming to his bone. It is real. It matters. It is the assembly God commanded. But breath is God's part alone, and it comes in the second half of the chapter. After a second command, our part is the speaking and the assembling. We do not have to be able to finish it. Then comes verse 11, and God explains the whole vision. Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. Behold, they say, our bones are dried, and our hope is lost. We are cut off for our parts. Listen to what the people said, because those are three separate complaints. Our bones are dried. We have been in this condition too long. Our hope is lost. We stopped expecting anything. We are cut off. We have been separated from the promise, from the land, from the record, from each other. That third one is the one I keep returning to. Cut off. In Hebrew thought, being cut off is not simply being far away. It is being severed from the line, removed from the reckoning, no longer counted among the people. And here is what I need you to see. God does not correct their assessment of the facts. He does not tell them they are exaggerating. The bones really were dry. The situation really was that bad. He answers a true description of despair with a promise, not with a lecture about their attitude. And what a promise it is. Verse 12. Therefore prophesy and say unto them, Thus saith the Lord God, Behold, O my people, I will open your graves, and cause you to come up out of your graves, and bring you into the land of Israel. Verse 13. And ye shall know that I am the Lord, when I have opened your graves, O my people, and brought you up out of your graves. Twice in 2 verses. I will open your graves, not I will comfort you where you are. Open. Bring up. Bring home. Black America. Hear the address on that promise. It was not spoken to a people who were doing fine. It was spoken to a people who had concluded they were erased from the record entirely, cut off, uncounted, no longer part of the reckoning. That is precisely the condition of every ground we have walked tonight. And what God says over that condition is that He personally knows where every one of them is, and He is the one who opens graves. Your dead are documented. Your dead are located. Your dead are named. And the God who kept track of one coffin for 400 years in Egypt has not lost 5 acres under Manhattan. So let me get practical with you, because a promise you cannot act on turns into a feeling, and feelings fade by Thursday. Here is the first thing to understand about American law on this subject, and it surprised me when I learned it. Most states already protect unmarked human burials. Virginia, Texas, Florida, South Carolina, and many others carry statutes covering abandoned and unmarked graves, requiring permits, notification, and often a court order before anybody disturbs them. The law is not missing. The law has simply been waiting on a document that nobody produced, which means documentation is the entire lever. A file survey converts an ordinary commercial lot into a site with legal standing, and it does that quietly, through a state historic preservation office, without a single person having to sue anybody. Think about how the Tampa and Clearwater cases actually moved. Not a courtroom first. A radar cart, a written report, and a state file number. That report is what forced every conversation that followed, because once a finding sits on file with a date on it, an agency can no longer say it did not know. So the survey is the leverage, not the lawsuit. I want to be careful here and not oversell it, because outcomes still vary enormously by state, by county, and by who owns the parcel. Some of these fights take a decade. But the difference between a rumor and a filed report is the difference between a family story nobody can act on and a document an institution has to answer. One is memory, and memory dies with the person holding it. The other is a record with an author, a date, and a coordinate. Getting from the first to the second is the whole task, and as of a few years ago, there is federal money aimed at exactly this. The African American Burial Grounds Preservation Act was signed into law in December 2022. It established a program administered through the National Park Service to identify, research, preserve, and interpret historic African American burial grounds across the country. That is not a symbolic resolution passed to make somebody feel better on an anniversary. It is an authorized grant program with real money attached, pointed at precisely the work this whole video has been describing. The program operates as the African American Burial Grounds Network, and it is built to work with the very people most likely to be listening to me right now. Not only universities and professional archaeologists, local nonprofits, churches, descendant associations, county historical societies, city governments. The Park Service maintains a directory of known sites, and part of the network's purpose is helping a community get a burial ground identified and documented in the first place, which is the exact step that was impossible for 300 years. Look it up by name tonight. I want to say plainly why that law matters more than it might sound. In every case we walked through tonight, the missing ingredients were the same. Two things: money to pay for the search, and standing to make somebody listen. Nobody would fund the radar. Nobody in authority had to respond. That specific gap now has a federal program aimed directly at it. I am not going to tell you the program is large enough or fast enough, because I genuinely do not know that yet. What I will tell you is that the door that was shut in 1991 is not shut anymore. There is a second payoff too, and for a lot of families, it turns out to be the bigger one. A burial record is a name your family can actually hold in its hands. Church burial registers, funeral home ledgers, sexton books, burial society and cemetery association minute books. These documents recorded Black people by name, in their own handwriting, at a time when almost nothing else in this country did. A good sexton book will give you a name, a date, a section, a row, often a cause of death, and the name of whoever paid for the plot. Anybody who has tried to trace a Black American family tree knows about the 1870 wall. Before the 1870 census, most enslaved ancestors do not appear by name in federal records at all. They appear as tally marks by age and sex on a slave schedule, and the trail simply goes cold there. Burial records are one of the few paper sources that can reach back across that wall, because churches and burial societies kept their own books on their own terms, answering to nobody. Freedmen's Bureau records, church marriage registers, and Black funeral home ledgers work the same way. That is why a located grave is worth so much more than a plaque. It is a fixed point in a broken paper trail. Once you have a cemetery, a section, and a date, you suddenly have something to hang the census records on, something to match against a church roll, something concrete to bring to an older relative that unlocks what they have been carrying and never had a reason to say. I have watched that unlock happen for people more than once, and I will tell you, it does not feel like history. It feels like being handed back a relative. Now look at what communities actually won once a survey came back positive, because this is the encouraging half of the record, and it deserves to be said out loud. In Tampa, after the Zion Cemetery findings, the housing standing above those graves came down. The residents living there were relocated, and the ground was assembled back together and committed to a memorial rather than to redevelopment. In Sugar Land, the 95 were reinterred at a dedicated memorial cemetery, with Fort Bend County and the school district carrying ongoing responsibility for the site. In Charleston, the Anson Street ancestors were studied, given names, through a community process of prayer and deliberation, and reburied in 2019 in a public ceremony where every one of the 36 was called by name in front of thousands of people. In Richmond, the paid parking lot sitting over the Shockoe Bottom burial ground was finally closed and that ground reclaimed in 2011. In Manhattan, the African Burial Ground became a national monument in 2006, with a visitor center standing on the site today. Those are real, physical, permanent outcomes. But notice the sequence, because it is identical in all 5 cases, without a single exception. The community moved first. The institution followed second. Not once in this entire record did an agency wake up on its own and volunteer to go looking. Every time, it was descendants, church members, local historians and journalists who pushed hard enough and long enough that an institution finally had to answer. I went back and forth on how bluntly to say that part, and here is where I land. The pattern is far too consistent to soften. Somebody has to be the one standing in the field. So, before you go to sleep tonight, here are 4 places to look. Every state has one. Every one of them maintains a site file of recorded archaeological and historic properties, and cemeteries are in it. Search your county. Ask specifically whether any African American or Black burial grounds are recorded, and ask whether any have been surveyed. That single email, sent tonight, is a real act. Land records are cumulative. The old survey never leaves the book. If a Black cemetery was platted in your county in 1890 or 1901 or 1920, that plat is likely still on file, even if the parcel above it is now a shopping center. Ask the church office, the historian, or the oldest member of the congregation about the burial register, the sexton book, or the burial society records. See what is already listed near you, and see what the grant program supports. And if you find nothing in any of the 4, that is not a dead end, and it is not disappointment. In this work, an empty file usually means nobody has looked yet, which means you are now the first person in your county to ask the question out loud. Let me close where Ezekiel closes, verse 14. And shall put my spirit in you, and ye shall live, and I shall place you in your own land. Then shall ye know that I, the Lord, have spoken it, and performed it, saith the Lord, spoken it, and performed it. Both. God does not leave the sentence at spoken. He puts performed right beside it, in the same breath, as the same promise. So say this out loud tonight, wherever you are. My dead are documented. My dead are located. My dead are named. Not lost, not gone. Not erased from the reckoning. Under a parking lot in Tampa, under a street in Manhattan, under a school in Texas, and under whatever ground your own family lies in, known by God, held by God, and waiting on a morning he has already fixed the date of. And that is the inheritance, so let me name it plainly, rather than leave you angry. You come from people who bought the coffin when they could not afford the coffin. Who pinned the shroud under a law that capped how many of them could stand at the grave? Who turned the body east because they believed the Lord was coming back from that direction? That faith is what got handed down to you, not the loss, the faith.